Daniel sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the piano in the corner of his tiny Brooklyn apartment. The instrument had been his best friend for 15 years, but lately, it felt more like a reminder of everything that wasn't working in his life. He was 28 years old, and by all accounts, he should have been living his dream. He'd graduated from one of the best music conservatories in the country. He could play Chopin, Rachmaninoff, and Beethoven with his eyes closed. His technique was flawless. His sight reading was perfect. But somehow none of that seemed to matter anymore. The rejection letter from the Metropolitan Orchestra still sat on his kitchen counter. He'd read it so many times he had it memorized. Your technical proficiency is outstanding, but we're looking for musicians who can bring emotional depth and originality to their interpretations. Emotional depth. The words stung every time he thought about them. He'd spent his entire life trying to play things exactly the way they were supposed to be played. Every note in the right place. Every crescendo and diminuendo exactly as marked in the sheet music. That's what his teachers had demanded. That's what he'd been trained to do. But apparently it wasn't enough. Daniel walked over to the window and looked down at the street below. It was Friday night and the neighborhood was coming alive. People were laughing, heading to restaurants and clubs. Music drifted up from somewhere downstairs. Not classical music. Something else. Something with a heavy beat that made the windows rattle slightly. He'd been hearing that music for months now. At first it had annoyed him. Too loud, too repetitive, too simple, he'd thought. But lately he found himself listening more carefully. There was something about it that grabbed you, something that made you want to move. His classical training told him it was just noise, but his body disagreed. Daniel made himself a cup of coffee and sat down at his laptop. He had 3 piano lessons to teach tomorrow, all to kids who would rather be playing video games. That's what his career had become, teaching Twinkle Twinkle Little Star to 7-year-olds who didn't want to be there, while their parents stood in the doorway checking their phones. He opened YouTube, not really sure what he was looking for. The algorithm started suggesting videos, classical performances at first, then something different caught his eye. Classical music meets electronic. He clicked on it more out of boredom than real interest. The video showed a young woman at a keyboard, surrounded by electronic equipment he didn't recognize. She started playing a piece he knew well, a Bach prelude, but then something strange happened. The melody was still there, still recognizably Bach, but underneath it came these deep pulsing sounds. Electronic beats, strange effects that twisted and warped the familiar notes into something completely new. Daniel watched the whole thing twice. Then he watched another video. And another. He spent the next 3 hours going down a rabbit hole of electronic music production, remixes and mashups. By the time he looked up, it was past midnight. The next morning, he woke up with an idea buzzing in his head. It was crazy. His professors would have called it sacrilege. But he couldn't stop thinking about it. After his last piano lesson on Saturday, Daniel found himself walking into a music production store. The place was intimidating. Walls covered with equipment he'd never seen before. Keyboards with hundreds of buttons and knobs, computer screens showing waveforms and colorful interfaces. A young guy with headphones around his neck approached him. "Can I help you find something?" Daniel hesitated. "I'm a classical pianist," he said, feeling immediately stupid for starting that way. "But I want to learn about electronic music production. I don't even know where to start." The guy smiled. "That's actually really cool. We get a lot of people coming in here, but not many with your background. What kind of sound are you going for?" "I don't know yet," Daniel admitted. "I just know I need to try something different." 2 hours later, Daniel walked out with a MIDI controller, an audio interface, and a recommendation for some basic production software. His bank account was lighter by almost $1,000, money he really couldn't afford to spend. But something inside him knew this was important. That night, he set everything up in his apartment. The installation took forever. Nothing worked the way it was supposed to. Error messages popped up constantly. He watched tutorial after tutorial, trying to understand terms like VST plugins and audio routing and MIDI mapping. It was completely different from learning classical piano. With piano, there was always a clear right and wrong. Either you hit the right note or you didn't. Either your timing was correct or it wasn't, but this was something else entirely. There were infinite possibilities, infinite sounds you could create. By 3 in the morning, he'd managed to produce exactly 30 seconds of music. It sounded terrible. The beats didn't line up properly. The electronic sounds clashed with the piano melody he'd recorded. But he'd done it. He'd created something that had never existed before. Daniel saved the file and fell into bed, exhausted but more energized than he'd felt in years. The next few weeks were a blur. He taught his piano lessons during the day, going through the motions with his students. But at night, he was a different person. He watched hundreds of hours of tutorials. He learned about EQ and compression, about synthesizers and drum machines, about how to layer sounds and create builds and drops. His neighbors complained about the noise. His sleep schedule fell apart. He lived on coffee and instant noodles. But for the first time since he could remember, Daniel was excited to wake up and make music. He started simple, taking classical pieces he knew well and trying to add electronic elements. Most of his experiments failed. The classical melodies and electronic beats seemed to come from different worlds, refusing to fit together. But occasionally something would click, a moment where the old and new combined into something that made his heart race. His classical training, which had felt like a prison, suddenly became a tool. He understood harmony and melody in ways that most electronic producers didn't. He could read complex musical scores and break them down into their essential elements. He knew how to create tension and release, how to build emotional arcs through a piece of music. One night, after another failed audition for a teaching position at a local college, Daniel sat down at his piano feeling defeated. Almost without thinking, he started playing Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata. His fingers knew every note by heart. The haunting, melancholic melody filled his small apartment, but then something different happened. His left hand started adding something new, a subtle bass line that wasn't in the original score. His foot tapped out a rhythm that had nothing to do with Beethoven. Before he knew what he was doing, he'd hit the record button on his laptop. He played the familiar melody with his right hand, but his left was creating something entirely new. When he finished the first section, he didn't stop. He started layering in electronic elements, a deep rumbling bass, a glitchy beat that pulsed underneath the classical melody, strange otherworldly sounds that twisted and warped around Beethoven's notes. Hours passed. Daniel was completely lost in the work, his classical training and his new electronic skills finally coming together. He was building something, layering sound upon sound, creating a version of Moonlight Sonata that had never existed before. When he finally stopped, the sun was starting to come up. His hands were shaking. He saved the file, sat back, and hit play. What came out of his speakers made him forget how to breathe. It was strange and beautiful and wrong and perfect all at once. The melody he'd known since childhood was still there, still recognizably Beethoven, but it had been transformed into something else, something that made his chest feel tight and his eyes water. For the first time in his life, Daniel wasn't trying to play music the way someone else wanted him to play it. He was making something that came from inside him, something that felt true. He played the track 3 more times, then finally fell asleep at his keyboard, more at peace than he'd been in years. He had no idea what to do with what he'd created, or if anyone else would even want to hear it, but that didn't matter right now. He'd found his voice, and that changed everything. Daniel lived 2 completely different lives for the next 3 months. During the day, he was the same person he'd always been. He taught piano to kids who mostly didn't want to be there. Mrs. Peterson's daughter struggled through scales every Tuesday. The Anderson twins fought over who got to sit at the piano first. Little Tommy asked every single week if they could please learn a song from a video game instead of Mozart. Daniel smiled, stayed patient, and taught them the way he'd been taught. Proper hand position, correct posture, reading sheet music note by note. It paid the bills barely, and that was all that mattered. But at night, he became someone else entirely. As soon as his last student left, Daniel would close the door, make a pot of coffee, and dive into a world he was only beginning to understand. His small apartment became a laboratory. The piano sat next to his laptop, surrounded by cables and equipment. His neighbors had stopped complaining about the noise. They'd probably given up. Learning electronic music production was nothing like learning classical piano. With piano, there had always been a teacher standing over him, correcting every mistake. There were rules, traditions, proper ways to do things. But with electronic music, there were no rules. Or maybe there were infinite rules that you got to make up yourself. He spent hours watching producers on YouTube, trying to understand how they got their sounds. He'd pause videos, rewind them, watch the same 30 seconds over and over until he understood what button they'd pressed or what plugin they'd used. Some nights he felt like a genius, creating sounds that gave him goosebumps. Other nights, after 6 hours of work, he'd delete everything and start over. His production skills were improving, but something still felt off. His classical background and his electronic experiments existed in two separate boxes, refusing to merge. Then one night, Daniel had a breakthrough. He was working on a simple beat, nothing fancy, when he accidentally triggered a piano sample he'd recorded earlier. It was just a few notes from a Chopin nocturne, played clean and pure, but when those notes hit over the electronic bass line, something magical happened. The classical melody didn't fight with the electronic elements. It danced with them. The old and new didn't cancel each other out. They made each other stronger. Daniel sat up straight, his heart pounding. He spent the next 5 hours building on that idea, carefully weaving classical melodies into electronic frameworks. By sunrise, he had something that made him smile. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. It was him. That's when he started thinking about the Moonlight Sonata remix he'd created weeks ago. He pulled up the file and listened to it with fresh ears. It was rough. The mixing was amateur. The transitions were clunky. But underneath all that, there was something special. He spent the next 2 weeks refining it. He learned about EQ and how to make different sounds sit together in a mix. He studied how dubstep producers created their signature wobbling bass lines and applied that knowledge carefully, making sure it enhanced Beethoven's melody rather than overwhelming it. The piece started to take shape. The familiar opening of Moonlight Sonata played straight for the first 30 seconds, clean and melancholic, just piano. Then subtly at first, electronic elements crept in, a soft pad sound underneath, a gentle pulse, building slowly. At the 1-minute mark, everything dropped. The beat came in hard, but the classical melody stayed on top, now transformed, urgent, alive in a way it had never been before. Beethoven's notes wove through electronic wobbles and glitchy effects, sometimes disappearing, sometimes bursting through triumphant. Daniel added a middle section where everything stripped back to just piano again, giving listeners a moment to breathe before the final build and drop. He wanted people to hear both sides of the music, to understand that he wasn't trying to destroy Beethoven's work, but to show it from a new angle. When he finally considered it finished, he sat back and played it for the 100th time. His hands were sweating. This was either the best thing he'd ever created or the worst idea he'd ever had. He honestly couldn't tell anymore. For a week, the track just sat on his laptop. Daniel told himself he was being careful, waiting for the right moment. But really, he was terrified. What if people hated it? What if his old professors heard it and thought he'd lost his mind? What if he'd spent 3 months learning all this new stuff for nothing? His roommate Kevin finally forced the issue. Kevin worked in advertising and had a much more relaxed view of life than Daniel did. "Dude, you've been talking about this track for weeks," Kevin said one night, eating pizza in their kitchen. "Just put it out there. What's the worst that could happen?" "Everyone could think it's terrible," Daniel said. "So what? You're already playing Twinkle Twinkle for kids all day. How much worse can it get?" Kevin laughed, but his point landed. That night, Daniel started researching places where he could actually perform electronic music live. He'd played classical recitals, of course, but this was different territory. He needed somewhere that would understand what he was trying to do. He found a place called The Underground, a small venue in Brooklyn that hosted experimental electronic music nights. They had something called Open Deck Night every month where new producers could perform. The next one was in 2 weeks. Daniel's finger hovered over the submit button on the application form for 20 minutes. Finally, he closed his eyes and clicked. The confirmation email arrived the next morning. "Thanks for applying. We'll let you know if you're selected by Friday." The week that followed was torture. Daniel checked his email constantly. He practiced his performance over and over, making sure he knew exactly when to trigger each element, when to twist the knobs on his controller, when to let the music breathe. On Friday afternoon, the email came. "Hey, we loved your sample. You're in for next month's Open Deck Night. Bring your own equipment. You get 15 minutes. See you there." Daniel read the email 5 times. Then he stood up and paced around his apartment, too nervous and excited to sit still. This was actually happening. He was going to perform his Moonlight Sonata remix in front of real people. The next 2 weeks were a blur of preparation and panic. Daniel practiced obsessively. He made backups of his track. He tested his equipment setup again and again. He barely slept. He didn't tell anyone what he was doing, not his students, not his family, not even his old friends from the conservatory. This felt too fragile, too strange to explain. How do you tell people who know you as a classical pianist that you're about to perform Beethoven with dubstep drops at an underground electronic music venue? Kevin knew, obviously, since they lived together. "You're going to kill it," he said the night before the performance. "And if you don't, at least it'll be a good story." That wasn't as comforting as Kevin probably meant it to be. The night of the performance, Daniel arrived at the underground 2 hours early. The venue was smaller than he'd expected, just a basement room with a small stage, some lights, and a bar. But it was packed with equipment and speakers that looked serious. He watched the sound check for the other performers, feeling completely out of place. Everyone else seemed to know each other. They used terms he didn't understand. They talked about plugins and producers he'd never heard of. They all dressed in streetwear and hoodies while he'd worn a button-down shirt like he was going to a classical recital. First time, a woman with bright blue hair asked him. She was setting up her own equipment nearby. "Is it that obvious?" Daniel asked. She laughed. "Little bit. Don't worry. Everyone's cool here." "What's your set like?" Daniel hesitated. "It's kind of experimental. I take classical piano pieces and mix them with electronic elements." "Oh, that's sick." Her eyes lit up. "We definitely need more of that. Too many people just playing the same generic stuff." Her enthusiasm made him feel slightly better. Slightly. The venue started filling up around 9. Daniel watched from backstage as the crowd arrived. They were young, most of them, dressed in ways that made it clear they were here for electronic music, not Beethoven. Some were already dancing to the pre-show music. Others stood in groups, drinks in hand, chatting and laughing. These were not his people. These were not the audiences he'd performed for at conservatory recitals, where everyone sat quietly and clapped politely at the end. This was something else entirely. The show started. The first few performers went on playing their sets. The crowd responded with energy, cheering, moving to the music. Daniel studied everything, trying to understand the vibe, the energy, what made people react. Then someone was tapping him on the shoulder. "You're up next." "You ready?" No, Daniel thought, but he nodded anyway. He walked on stage carrying his laptop and controller, his hands shaking so hard he almost dropped his cables. The stage lights were bright. He couldn't see the audience clearly, just shapes in the darkness beyond the lights. He plugged everything in, opened his laptop, loaded his track. His heart was hammering so hard he could hear it in his ears. The MC's voice came over the speakers. "All right, next up we've got somebody new. Let's show some love." There was applause, polite but minimal. The crowd was still warming up, still deciding if this next performer was worth their attention. Daniel's finger hovered over the space bar. This was it, the moment where everything either worked or fell apart. He took a deep breath, thought about all those hours in his apartment, all those nights of practice and doubt and hope, and then he hit play. The opening notes of Moonlight Sonata filled the underground. For a moment, Daniel couldn't breathe. The familiar melody floated through the speakers, pure and clean, just piano, the same notes Beethoven had written over 200 years ago. The same notes Daniel had played 1,000 times in practice rooms and recitals. But this crowd wasn't here for classical music. He watched their reactions from behind his keyboard. Some people pulled out their phones, looking bored. Others turned toward the bar, already losing interest. A few stood with their arms crossed, waiting to see where this was going. Daniel's stomach dropped. This was a mistake. These people wanted bass drops and energy, not some old piano piece they'd probably been forced to learn in middle school. But he'd committed now. There was no backing out. 30 seconds in, right on cue, Daniel triggered the first electronic element. A deep rumbling bass note entered underneath the piano melody. Then another. The pulse started, subtle at first, just a heartbeat under Beethoven's melancholy theme. A few heads in the crowd turned back toward the stage. Daniel's fingers moved across his MIDI controller, adding layers, an atmospheric pad sound wrapped around the classical melody. The beat started building, getting stronger. The piano continued playing that famous theme, but now it was riding on top of something else, something that made the floor vibrate. More people were watching now. The crowd's energy shifted slightly. Then, at the 1-minute mark, Daniel hit the first drop. The bass exploded through the speakers. Deep wobbling aggressive, but the Moonlight Sonata melody was still there. Transformed now, urgent and powerful, weaving through the electronic chaos like a golden thread. The classical and the modern crashed together in a way that shouldn't have worked, but somehow did. The crowd erupted. People who'd been standing still suddenly started moving. Heads nodded to the beat. Hands went up in the air. The dance floor, which had been half empty a minute ago, started filling up. Daniel watched it happen, almost unable to believe it. These people, who probably couldn't care less about classical music, were dancing to Beethoven. They were feeling it, connecting with it, in a way that never would have happened if he'd just sat at a piano and played it straight. He rode the energy, his hands moving across the controls with growing confidence. He knew every second of this track, had practiced it so many times he could perform it in his sleep. But feeling it live with real people responding was completely different from sitting alone in his apartment. The track built and dropped again. Each time the classical melody returned, it came back transformed, sometimes soft and haunting, sometimes powerful and triumphant. Daniel had programmed it to feel like a journey, taking the listener through different emotions, different landscapes. Around the 3-minute mark, he stripped everything back. Just piano again, playing those familiar notes, giving everyone a moment to breathe. The crowd quieted slightly, swaying now instead of jumping. Then came the final build. Daniel pushed the energy higher and higher, layering in more elements, more complexity. The bass got deeper. The beats got harder. The classical melody soared over everything, Beethoven's genius amplified by modern technology. The final drop hit like a bomb. The entire venue seemed to shake. People were screaming, jumping, completely lost in the music. Daniel couldn't keep the smile off his face. This was what music was supposed to feel like. Not sitting in a quiet concert hall afraid to move or breathe, but this, raw energy and emotion and connection. When the track ended, there was a moment of silence. Then the crowd went absolutely wild. The applause and cheering were deafening. People were shouting, pumping their fists. Daniel stood there, hands shaking, barely able to process what had just happened. He'd hoped people wouldn't hate it. He never imagined this. He unplugged his equipment in a daze, his ears ringing. As he walked off stage, people kept stopping him. Dude, that was insane. What was that song? I know it from somewhere. You just made Beethoven cool, man. That's crazy. The woman with blue hair from earlier found him at the bar. I told you that would be sick. Everyone's talking about it. You've got to send me that track. Daniel felt like he was floating. The other performers came up to congratulate him, to ask about his process, to exchange contact information. These people, who'd seemed so intimidating a few hours ago, were treating him like one of them. But in the back of his mind, a small voice worried. What would his old teachers think? What about his classical music friends? He'd just taken one of the most respected pieces in the classical repertoire and turned it into, what, a party song? A meme? He pushed those thoughts away. Tonight he just wanted to enjoy this feeling. Around midnight, as Daniel was packing up his equipment, a guy approached him. He was older than most of the crowd, maybe in his 30s, wearing a leather jacket. That was a really interesting performance, the guy said. I'm Ryan. I run a small recording studio in Manhattan. Have you thought about recording a proper version of that track? Daniel blinked. I mean, the version I played tonight was recorded. I produced it in my apartment. Right, but I mean a professional recording. Better mixing, mastering, the whole thing. I think you've got something special here, and I'd love to help you develop it. They talked for 20 minutes. Ryan gave Daniel his card and told him to think about it. No pressure, just an offer to collaborate if Daniel was interested. Daniel walked home that night feeling like he was in a dream. The city lights seemed brighter. The subway ride felt shorter. Everything felt possible in a way it hadn't in years. Kevin was still awake when Daniel got home, playing video games on the couch. So, Kevin asked, did you crash and burn? No, Daniel said, unable to keep the grin off his face. I think it went okay. Just okay. Okay, it was amazing. They loved it. And some studio guy wants to help me record it professionally. Kevin jumped up and gave him a high five. I told you. I told you it would be awesome. Daniel collapsed on the couch next to him, exhausted but too wired to sleep. He pulled out his phone to check his messages and froze. Someone had tagged him on Instagram. Then another tag. Then another. His hand started shaking again as he opened the app. The video was already there, posted by someone he'd never met. The caption read, "This classical pianist just destroyed Beethoven with dubstep at the Underground. This is the most insane thing I've ever seen." The video had been posted 2 hours ago and already had 30,000 views. Daniel watched it, seeing himself on stage from the audience's perspective. The video quality wasn't great, recorded on somebody's phone, but you could feel the energy. You could see the moment when the crowd started moving, when they connected with what he was doing. The comments were exploding. Hundreds of them growing by the minute. "This is fire. I need the full version right now. Classical. Music just got interesting. Beethoven would actually love this. This is disrespectful to the original. No, this is genius." Daniel sat there, scrolling through comment after comment, his heart racing. He'd hoped maybe a few people in that audience would remember his performance. He never expected this. He checked again an hour later. 50,000 views. By morning, it was at 200,000. Daniel didn't sleep that night. He couldn't. He kept refreshing the video, watching the numbers climb, reading the comments. Some were positive, some were negative, but everyone was talking about it. His phone started buzzing with notifications, friend requests from people he'd never met, messages asking about the track. Someone wanted to know if he was available for a party. A music blog had messaged asking for an interview. By the time the sun came up, the video had 500,000 views. Daniel made coffee with shaking hands. This couldn't be real. Things like this didn't happen to people like him. He was just a piano teacher who'd made a weird remix in his apartment. He wasn't supposed to go viral. His phone rang. A number he didn't recognize. "Hello? Is this Daniel? The guy from the Underground last night?" The voice was professional, businesslike. "Yes? This is Jennifer Rodriguez from the Metro Music blog. We're the largest electronic music publication in the region. I was wondering if you'd be interested in doing an interview. That video of your performance is absolutely blowing up right now." Daniel agreed to the interview, barely able to form coherent sentences. When he hung up, another call was already coming in. Then another text message. Then an email. The next few days were a blur. The video kept growing. 1 million views. 2 million. 5 million? It spread across platforms from Instagram to Twitter to TikTok. Music reaction channels started covering it. Classical music forums were arguing about whether it was brilliant or blasphemous. Some people loved it. They called it innovative, fresh, a perfect blend of old and new. They said it made classical music accessible to people who'd never cared about it before. Others hated it. They said he was destroying a masterpiece, that he was disrespecting Beethoven's legacy, that he had no right to mess with something so sacred. The negative comments stung, especially when they came from people in the classical music world. His old professor from the conservatory posted on Facebook, "This is what happens when musicians abandon discipline and respect for tradition." Beethoven would be spinning in his grave. That one hurt. Daniel had respected that professor for years, had tried so hard to live up to his standards. And now he was being publicly called out for betraying everything he'd been taught. But then other comments came in. A teenage girl wrote, "I always thought classical music was boring, but this made me actually listen to the whole Moonlight Sonata. Now I get why people love it." A music teacher commented, "I showed this to my students who never pay attention during our classical unit. They were transfixed. Whatever gets people interested in this music, I'm for it." Those comments made Daniel think maybe he'd done something right after all. The interview requests kept coming. Podcasts, YouTube channels, music magazines. Everyone wanted to know his story, his process, his plans. Daniel did as many as he could, trying to explain that he wasn't trying to destroy classical music, but to show it from a new angle. Then, 2 weeks after that night at the Underground, Daniel got an email that made his hands shake all over again. It was from Lincoln Center. Daniel read the email 3 times before it really sank in. Lincoln Center. The Lincoln Center. One of the most prestigious performing arts venues in the world. The place where he'd once dreamed of performing traditional classical repertoire in a proper concert hall. They were inviting him to perform at their experimental music series. His first instinct was to assume it was spam or a prank. But no, the email address was legitimate. The signature included a phone number and official letterhead. This was real. The director of their contemporary music program had seen the viral video. She wanted Daniel to perform his Moonlight Sonata remix, along with any other work he'd been developing, as part of their New Voices in Classical series. Daniel sat at his kitchen table, staring at his laptop screen, trying to process this. A month ago, he'd been teaching Mary Had a Little Lamb to kids who didn't want to learn. Now Lincoln Center was asking him to perform, but the email also made him nervous. This wasn't some underground club where the audience came expecting experimental sounds. This was Lincoln Center. The audience would include serious classical music patrons, people who'd been going to concerts there for decades, people who probably thought his video was an abomination. His phone buzzed. A text from Ryan, the studio owner he'd met at the Underground. Saw the Lincoln Center news already making rounds on music Twitter. Congrats. We should definitely get that track professionally recorded before the performance. How was it already on Twitter? Daniel checked, and sure enough, someone had leaked the news. The music community was talking about it, and the reactions were exactly as mixed as he'd expected. This is incredible. Classical music needs this kind of innovation. Lincoln Center has lost its mind. This is disgraceful. Can't wait to see this live. Classical music is dying, and this is why. The comments went on and on. Daniel closed Twitter. He couldn't spend his time reading what strangers thought about him. He had actual work to do. Over the next few weeks, Daniel threw himself into preparation. He took Ryan up on the offer to professionally record and mix his Moonlight Sonata remix. The difference between his apartment recording and the professional version was staggering. Every element suddenly had space to breathe. The bass hit harder. The piano sang clearer. The electronic elements danced around the classical melody instead of fighting with it. But one track wasn't enough for a full performance. Lincoln Center wanted 30 to 45 minutes of material. Daniel had to create more. He went back to his apartment studio and started working. He experimented with other classical pieces, trying to find ones that could handle the same treatment. Some worked brilliantly. Others fell flat no matter what he tried. He found that pieces with strong emotional cores translated best. Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major became a deep, melancholic journey with trip-hop beats and atmospheric pads. A section from Vivaldi's Winter got transformed with glitchy electronics and aggressive bass, emphasizing the harshness and beauty of the season. But not everything worked. His attempt at remixing Bach's Goldberg variations turned into a mess. The mathematical perfection of Bach's composition didn't want to be twisted into electronic shapes. After 2 weeks of trying, Daniel scrapped it entirely. The hardest part wasn't the music itself. It was dealing with the attention. His phone never stopped buzzing. Interview requests, collaboration offers, angry messages from classical purists, enthusiastic messages from new fans. His social media following had exploded from a couple hundred people to over 200,000. Some of the attention was wonderful. Producers he'd admired for years were reaching out to collaborate. Young musicians were messaging him saying he'd inspired them to experiment with their own sound, but some of it was brutal. Classical music forums tore him apart. Some people called him a sellout, a fraud, a disgrace to his training. Someone created a whole YouTube video essay about how his work represented everything wrong with modern culture's relationship to art. The worst moment came when he got a message from his old piano teacher, Professor Williams. The man who'd spent years teaching Daniel proper technique, who'd pushed him to audition for top conservatories, who'd believed in his potential. The message was short. I saw your viral video. I have to say I'm deeply disappointed. We spent years building your classical foundation, and this is what you do with it? This is not what I trained you for. Daniel stared at that message for an hour. Part of him wanted to defend himself, to explain that he was using everything Professor Williams had taught him, just in a different way. But another part of him wondered if the professor was right. Had he wasted years of training? Was he destroying something beautiful just to get attention? He called his mom that night, something he hadn't done in weeks. I saw your video, she said immediately. Everyone in my book club has been talking about it. What did they say? Daniel asked, not sure he wanted to know. Well, Beverly thinks it's wonderful. She says her grandson showed it to her, and now he wants to learn piano. But Patricia thinks it's, what did she call it? Noise. She walked out of book club early. Great, Daniel muttered. Honey, can I tell you something? His mom's voice got serious. I've watched you play piano since you were 6 years old, and I've never seen you smile while playing the way you smiled in that video, not once in 22 years. That has to mean something. Daniel felt his eyes get wet. But what if Professor Williams is right? What if I'm just wasting everything I learned? Are you using what you learned? Well, yeah, but then you're not wasting it. You're just using it differently than he wanted. That's called growing up. They talked for another hour. By the end, Daniel felt slightly better. Not completely okay, but better. The Lincoln Center performance was scheduled for 3 months away. As it got closer, Daniel's anxiety increased. He practiced obsessively, perfecting his performance, making sure every transition was smooth, every sound was exactly right. But he also started receiving more direct pressure. A coalition of classical music purists started a petition to have his performance canceled. They claimed he was degrading the art form and that Lincoln Center was betraying its mission. The petition got 5,000 signatures. News outlets picked up the story. Suddenly, Daniel was at the center of a debate about classical music's future. Should it stay pure and traditional, or should it evolve and experiment? Was he helping or hurting the genre? Daniel tried to stay out of it, but that was impossible. Journalists wanted his comment on everything. Classical musicians were writing op-eds about him, some supportive, some scathing. Electronic music producers were defending him, saying classical music needed to stop being so precious. The whole thing felt surreal. He was just a guy who'd made a remix in his apartment. How had it turned into this? 2 weeks before the performance, Daniel got another unexpected message. This one was from Trevor Walsh, a famous classical pianist who'd won multiple international competitions. Daniel had grown up listening to his recordings. "I've been following your work with interest," the message read. "I'd like to meet for coffee if you're available. I think we should talk." They met at a quiet cafe in Manhattan. Trevor was in his 50s, impeccably dressed. Exactly what you'd expect from a world-class classical pianist. Daniel felt incredibly underdressed in his jeans and hoodie. "I'm not going to lecture you," Trevor said as they sat down. "I'm sure you've gotten plenty of that already." "You could say that. Here's the thing." Trevor leaned forward. "I've spent 30 years playing the same repertoire the same way. I'm very good at it. I've made a successful career out of it. But do you know what I've noticed?" Daniel shook his head. "Young people don't come to my concerts. They respect what I do, sure, but they don't connect with it. The audiences keep getting older. In 20 years, who's going to fill those concert halls?" He paused, stirring his coffee. "Then I watched your video. I watched these kids, these young people who've probably never been to a classical concert in their lives, losing their minds over Beethoven. They weren't pretending to like it. They genuinely felt it. And I thought, maybe this guy is doing something important." Daniel didn't know what to say. "But I also understand why the traditionalists are angry," Trevor continued. "Because change is scary, and you're forcing them to confront the possibility that the way we've been doing things might not be the only way." They talked for 2 hours. Trevor gave Daniel advice about the Lincoln Center performance, about how to handle the pressure, about how to stay true to his vision while respecting the tradition he came from. As they were leaving, Trevor said one more thing. "Whatever happens at that performance, remember this. Beethoven himself was considered radical in his time. He broke rules. He experimented. He made the old guard uncomfortable. So in a weird way, you might be more faithful to his spirit than people who insist on playing his work exactly as written." That conversation changed something in Daniel. He'd been so worried about whether he was doing the right thing, whether he was respecting classical music or destroying it. But maybe that was the wrong question. Maybe the right question was whether he was being honest, whether he was creating something meaningful. The night before the Lincoln Center performance, Daniel barely slept. His equipment was checked and rechecked. His tracks were backed up on 3 different drives. He'd practiced so much he could perform everything in his sleep, but none of that mattered if his nerve failed. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, thinking about the journey that had brought him here. From those lonely nights in his apartment feeling like a failure, to this moment. From those first clumsy experiments with electronic music, to a performance at one of the world's most prestigious venues. The kid who'd spent years trying to play everything perfectly, exactly as the sheet music dictated, was gone. In his place was someone willing to take risks, to experiment, to potentially fail in front of thousands of people. Daniel's phone buzzed with a final message from Kevin. "You're going to crush it tomorrow. And if you don't, we'll move to Canada and start new lives." Daniel smiled in the darkness. Tomorrow everything would change again, one way or another. He just hoped he was ready. The morning of the Lincoln Center performance, Daniel woke up at 6 after maybe 3 hours of broken sleep. His stomach was in knots. His hands were already shaking, and he wasn't even at the venue yet. He made coffee, burned his toast, gave up on eating, and just stared out the window at the New York skyline. Somewhere out there was Lincoln Center. In 12 hours, he'd be on that stage. Kevin found him sitting at the kitchen table, looking pale. "You good?" Kevin asked, though the answer was obvious. "I think I'm going to throw up." "That's normal before a big performance, right?" "I've never felt like this before any performance." Daniel put his head in his hands. What if everyone walks out? What if the whole audience just gets up and leaves because they're so offended? "Then you'll have the coolest story ever," Kevin said. "But that's not going to happen. You've practiced for months. Your tracks are incredible. You're ready." Daniel wanted to believe him. He arrived at Lincoln Center 4 hours before showtime. The building was magnificent, exactly as impressive as he'd always imagined. But walking through those doors felt surreal. He'd dreamed of performing here his entire life, just not like this. The technical crew helped him set up his equipment on the stage. The hall was huge, row after row of seats rising up in the darkness. In a few hours, all those seats would be filled with people. Some would be there to support him. Others would be there hoping to watch him fail. "Sound check in 20 minutes, the stage manager told him. Daniel ran through his entire set during sound check, making sure every level was perfect, every transition was smooth. The acoustics in the hall were incredible. His piano notes rang out clear and pure. The bass hit deep and powerful. Everything sounded better than it ever had in his apartment or even in Ryan's studio. But that almost made it worse. There was nowhere to hide. Every note, every choice he'd made would be crystal clear to everyone in the audience. After sound check, Daniel went to the green room to wait. His phone was exploding with messages. Good luck texts from friends, supportive messages from fans, and unfortunately, some final hateful comments from people who thought his performance was an insult to classical music. He put his phone in his bag. He couldn't deal with any of that right now. At 7:30, someone knocked on the door. 15 minutes. Daniel's heart started racing even faster. He did breathing exercises his mom had taught him years ago when he used to get nervous before competitions. They didn't help much. At 7:40, another knock. 5 minutes. There's a full house out there. Full house. Over 1,000 people. Daniel closed his eyes and tried to center himself. Then it was time. He walked through the backstage area, his legs feeling like rubber. He could hear the murmur of the audience through the curtain. The energy was different from the underground. This crowd was quiet, waiting, judging already. The house lights dimmed. The stage manager gave him a nod. Daniel walked out onto the stage. The applause was polite but reserved. As his eyes adjusted to the lights, he could see the audience. It was the strangest mix he'd ever seen at a performance. Older patrons in formal wear sitting next to young people in hoodies. Classical music fans next to electronic music enthusiasts. People who'd probably never sat in the same room before, all here for this weird experiment he'd created. He sat at his keyboard, adjusted his microphone, and looked out at all those faces. For a moment, his mind went completely blank. He forgot what he was supposed to say, forgot what he was supposed to do. Then he remembered Trevor's words. Beethoven himself was considered radical. Daniel leaned toward the microphone. "When I was training at the conservatory," he said, his voice shaky at first, "I learned that there was a right way to play classical music. Every note in the right place. Every dynamic exactly as marked. Respect the composer. Honor the tradition." He paused, gathering his courage. "But here's what they didn't teach me." Beethoven went deaf, but he never stopped hearing music in his mind. He never stopped experimenting. He broke the rules of his time. He made people uncomfortable. The old guard thought he was destroying music, but really he was showing them what music could become. The audience was silent, listening. "Tonight I'm not trying to destroy Beethoven's work or disrespect classical music. I'm trying to show how these compositions can still move us, still surprise us, still speak to new generations in new ways. I'm trying to honor the spirit of experimentation that made these pieces revolutionary in the first place." He took a breath. This is Moonlight Sonata, like you've probably never heard it before. Daniel placed his hands on the keyboard and began to play. The opening notes were pure Beethoven. That haunting, melancholic melody that had captivated audiences for over 2 centuries. He played it straight for the first section, letting everyone remember why this piece was a masterpiece. The audience was dead silent, hanging on every note. Then subtly the electronic elements began to creep in. A soft pad underneath, a gentle pulse. The classical and modern started to blend, so gradually that you almost didn't notice it happening. Daniel glanced up briefly and saw the audience leaning forward, drawn in. At the 1-minute mark, he let the first drop hit. The bass exploded through the hall's perfect acoustics. The classical melody transformed, becoming urgent and powerful, riding on top of the electronic elements. Some people in the audience gasped. Others started nodding to the beat. Daniel lost himself in the performance. His classical training guided his fingers through Beethoven's melody, while his newer skills shaped the electronic landscape around it. He'd spent months perfecting this balance, making sure neither side overwhelmed the other. The piece built and dropped, breathing and pulsing. During the quieter middle section, when he stripped everything back to just piano, he could hear some people in the audience crying. The contrast between the acoustic and electronic moments made both sides more powerful. When the final drop came, even some of the older patrons who'd looked skeptical at the beginning were nodding along. The music had gotten to them, not because it was trendy or shocking, but because it was genuinely moving. The track ended with the same notes it began with. Just piano, just Beethoven. For a moment there was absolute silence. Then the applause started. It began in the back rows where the younger audience members sat. But it spread quickly, washing through the entire hall. Within seconds, people were on their feet. Not everyone, but more than Daniel had dared to hope. He stood and bowed, barely able to believe what was happening, but he wasn't done. He had 4 more pieces to perform. The second piece was his remix of Chopin's Nocturne. The third was the Vivaldi Winter reimagining. Each one showed a different approach to blending classical and electronic. Different ways of honoring the original while creating something new. By the 4th piece, even some of the people who'd started the performance with their arms crossed were moving to the music. Not everyone was convinced. Daniel could see some patrons sitting stiffly, refusing to engage. But enough people were connecting with what he was doing to make the energy in the room electric. For his final piece, Daniel had prepared something special. It was an original composition, not a remix. He'd written it specifically for this performance, trying to create something that was equally classical and electronic from the ground up, rather than adapting existing work. This piece was personal. It told the story of his journey, from the rigidity of his early training to the freedom he'd found in experimentation. The piano and electronics didn't fight in this piece. They had a conversation, supporting each other, building together towards something neither could achieve alone. As he played, Daniel realized something. He wasn't just a classical pianist anymore, but he wasn't just an electronic producer either. He was something new, something in between, something that might not have a name yet. When the final note of his original composition faded, Daniel sat back exhausted and exhilarated. This time, the standing ovation was immediate and overwhelming. Even some of the skeptics were on their feet. The applause went on and on. People were cheering, whistling, stomping their feet. Daniel stood and bowed, tears streaming down his face. As he walked off stage, people were already lining up to talk to him. Journalists with questions, fans wanting autographs, other musicians wanting to collaborate. But in the crowd, Daniel spotted 2 faces that mattered more than any others. Professor Williams, his old piano teacher, was standing near the back. The expression on his face was complicated, not quite approval but not anger either, more like respect maybe.